They called him the King of 300 Mistresses, a legend born in the scent of sweat, perfume, and decay that clung to Versailles. The gilded halls echoed with lavish parties, while outside a kingdom was bleeding gold. Every night was a transaction, a new face, a new expense. Anonymous pamphlets, once dismissed as mere propaganda, have now been cross-referenced with court records, revealing a terrifying truth. The legend of 300 lovers was a lie, but the lie was created to hide something far worse. How much did this secret life truly cost the French people, and how was it methodically erased from the royal ledgers? History focuses on the mistresses, but it ignores the procurement network and the specific, chilling taste the king developed, a preference so dark it became a state secret. This is the story the official accounts were designed to bury. Stay with us as we follow the money and uncover the true human price of a king's desire. That price is being paid right now, on December 8, 1793. The air is sharp with the bite of winter and the metallic tang of fear. Listen. That sound is the groan of wooden wheels on frozen cobblestones, a rhythm of death inching its way through the streets of Paris. The woman in the cart, Jeanne Bécu, once known as the Comtesse du Berry, can feel every jolt in her bones. She was once the final obsession of King Louis XV, a woman who commanded the attention of a nation, draped in jewels that rivaled the crowns. Now her fine silks are gone, replaced by the rough tunic of a condemned prisoner. The jeering mob is a wall of sound and hate, their faces twisted into masks of revolutionary fervor. Before she was a prisoner, she was a king's favorite. Before the screams of the crowd, there were whispers in the gilded halls of Versailles. You've heard the legends, but the truth isn't in the number. It's in the organized process that created her. To understand how the king's last official mistress traveled from the royal bedchamber to the executioner's block, you have to understand the cold, terrifying machine she came from. Her journey is the key. It exposes not just a king's private life, but the rot that consumed an entire kingdom from the inside out. And it all began with a myth. A carefully constructed lie designed to distract from a reality far more depraved than any rumor. Her journey from the pinnacle of power to the base of the guillotine seems incomprehensible, but it is the final, bloody chapter in a story that began long before she was born. It's a story that has been deliberately twisted, a legend crafted to justify the very rage that now consumes her. To understand her end, we must go back to the beginning of that legend. History remembers him as the Libertine King, a monarch of insatiable appetites, a depraved monster presiding over a glittering court of sin. The stories painted a picture of a hedonistic seraglio, a palace of endless debauchery funded by a starving nation. The number that has echoed through the centuries is 300. 300 mistresses, a figure so immense it feels biblical, designed to evoke disgust and awe. But it is a lie, a powerful, effective, and deliberate lie. That number doesn't come from any official court record or credible diary. It was forged in the clandestine presses of London, written by political enemies safely at 100 leagues from the Bastille, and smuggled into France to poison the public mind. The stories were not history. They were ammunition. They were political weapons designed to transform a king's personal failings into a symbol of monstrous national corruption. The real scandal wasn't a fantasy of excess. It was a reality of cold, bureaucratic exploitation. The truth is not found in the lurid tales of wild orgies, but in the quiet, methodical process that procured and discarded human beings like commodities. The propagandists who invented the myth of the Libertine King were, ironically, blind to the true perversion happening right under their noses. They couldn't imagine a depravity so organized, so chillingly rational. Before we uncover that machine, we must first understand the world it operated in, a world where a king's bed was not just a place of pleasure, but the very center of political power. The propagandists who painted Louis XV as a ravenous beast missed the point entirely. They focused on the fiction of quantity because they failed to grasp the reality of the position. The true power, the real scandal, wasn't hidden in a secret harem. It was displayed in plain sight every single day at the very heart of the French court. To understand the world of Versailles, you must first understand that the king's primary mistress was not a dirty secret. She was a public institution. The position was called the maîtresse en titre, the official declared mistress. And it was, in every sense of the word, a job, a career. This was a quasi-institutionalized political role, a tradition born from centuries of cold, strategic necessity. Royal marriages were rarely about love. They were treaties written in flesh and blood, alliances sealed to secure borders and prevent wars. A king was often bound to a woman he barely knew, a political partner chosen for her pedigree, not for passion. While the church condemned adultery, the court and the country pragmatically accepted that a monarch would seek companionship elsewhere. A single official mistress was a tolerated, if often resented, part of the power structure. She was an open secret, a living symbol of the king's humanity and virility. But her role went far beyond the bedchamber. The maîtresse en titre was the second most powerful woman in the kingdom after the queen. She was a gatekeeper, or a confidant, and a political player of the highest order. Ambassadors sought her favor. Ministers whispered secrets in her ear, and hopeful courtiers begged for her patronage to advance their careers. Her influence was immense, her apartments at Versailles often a second center of government. For decades, this was the established order, a scandalous but predictable part of court life. The rules were understood by all, but Louis XV's reign would see this tradition stretched, twisted, and ultimately broken, beginning with a series of affairs that, while conventional on the surface, revealed the brutal politics simmering just beneath the veneer of courtly etiquette. This accepted role of the official mistress, a blend of public spectacle and private intimacy, was a familiar drama at Versailles. For the first decade of his adult reign, Louis XV played his part according to the established script, drawing his companions from the very highest echelons of the French aristocracy. Between 1732 and 1744, the king's attention was monopolized by a single family, the de Mailly-Nesle sisters. In a remarkable sequence of events, 4 of the 5 sisters would successively hold the title of maîtresse en titre. First came the discreet Louise Julie, then the ambitious Pauline Félicité, followed briefly by Diane Adélaïde, and finally the most cunning of them all, Marie-Anne. A 5th sister, Hortense Félicité, notably refused the king's advances and remained at court, a quiet observer of her siblings' rise and fall. While these affairs were scandalous, they were a familiar kind of scandal, contained within the closed world of the nobility. But this was no mere romance. It was a brutal game of power, and it produced its own kind of forensic evidence. After a short affair, Pauline became pregnant. She died in agony just days after giving birth to a son in 1741. The boy, named Charles de Vintimille, was officially the child of her husband, but no one at court was fooled. His paternity was an open secret, confirmed by a shocking physical resemblance to the monarch. As he grew, the boy became a walking, breathing piece of evidence, earning the court nickname Demi-Louis, Half-Louis, a constant living reminder of the king's infidelity. The sisters' tenure was also a masterclass in court intrigue. In 1742, the most ruthless sister, Marie-Anne, made her acceptance of the king's advances conditional on a shocking demand. the public dismissal and banishment of her own sibling, the current mistress, Louise Julie. The infatuated king complied. This act, a cruel betrayal played out on the public stage of Versailles, demonstrated that even within these conventional aristocratic affairs, the position of mistress conferred the power to dictate terms directly to the king. For 12 years, this was business as usual, a revolving door of aristocratic lovers, family rivalries, and illegitimate children who looked just like their royal father. But this predictable cycle was about to be shattered. The next woman to capture the king's eye would not come from the ancient nobility. She would come from the world of money, a commoner, an outsider. And her arrival would detonate a social bomb in the heart of Versailles, changing the rules of the game forever. The predictable aristocratic carousel of the Desmailly-Nestlé sisters had established a rhythm at court, a scandalous but stable routine. But in 1745, that rhythm was shattered by the arrival of a woman who broke every rule. Her name was Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, and she was not of the nobility. She was a member of the bourgeoisie, the wealthy middle class, a world the courtiers viewed with a mixture of envy and utter contempt. Her elevation to maîtresse en titre was not just a scandal. It was a seismic shock, a violation of the natural order. The outrage was palpable, dripping from the lips of every duke and duchess. They sneered that the king had taken a mistress whose mother is named Madame Poisson, Mrs. Fish. To them, she smelled of the common marketplace, not the perfumed air of Versailles. They were certain she would be a mere fling, a temporary amusement. They were wrong. Madame de Pompadour, as she would become known, was not just a lover. She was a stateswoman in the making. For nearly 2 decades, she would be the king's most indispensable advisor, the true center of power in France. Her physical relationship with the king, the very foundation of her position, lasted only a few years, ceasing around 1750. But her influence only grew. She became the gatekeeper. To get to the king, you had to go through her. Imagine the scene described in the memoirs of her own lady's maid. Foreign ambassadors, men who decided the fates of nations, were forced to conduct their business with Madame de Pompadour during her public toilette. Picture the intimate, almost sacred ritual of a woman at her dressing table, the soft dab of the powder puff, the precise application of rouge, the scent of expensive perfumes hanging in the air. And in the midst of this, the low murmur of state secrets, of alliances and treaties being negotiated. This fusion of the boudoir and the cabinet room was a potent and visible symbol of her unprecedented power. She had become more than a mistress. She was a partner, a prime minister in all but name. But this created a terrifyingly precarious situation. Her power, born in the king's bed, now had to survive without it. How could she keep her grip on the monarch when she no longer offered the one thing a mistress was meant to provide? A younger, more beautiful rival could appear at any moment and undo everything. A solution was needed, a dark, ingenious, and monstrous solution. Madame de Pompadour had achieved the impossible. She had transformed herself from a bourgeois outsider into the unshakable center of the French government. But her entire empire was built on a single, fragile foundation, the king's desire. And by 1750, that foundation had crumbled to dust. The physical relationship was over. Whether due to her frail health or the simple passage of time, the king no longer came to her bed. Suddenly, the woman who advised ministers and charmed ambassadors was facing a political crisis of the flesh. The whispers started immediately, slithering through the gilded corridors of Versailles. The Marquis d'Argenson, a court minister, noted in his journal in September 1752 that one is persuaded that the marquise will be dismissed. The courtiers who had despised her from the beginning could taste victory. They saw an empty bed and smelled blood in the water, For a woman whose power was born in the royal bedchamber, an empty bed was a political death sentence. She was now vulnerable. Any beautiful young aristocrat could, with a single night of passion, undo years of her meticulous work. She could be replaced, discarded, and forgotten. But they underestimated Jeanne Antoinette Poisson. She was not just a lover, she was a survivor, a brilliant strategist who understood the complex, brutal mechanics of power. She knew the king. She knew his melancholy, his profound boredom, and his appetites. She knew that if she could no longer satisfy those appetites herself, she would have to find another way. She would have to manage them. She had to ensure that the king's fleeting pleasures never again threatened her permanent power. A solution was needed, a dark, ingenious, and monstrous solution. For a woman whose power was born in the royal bedchamber, an empty bed was a political death sentence. A solution was needed, a dark, ingenious, and monstrous solution. And it would be given a name that has become infamous in the annals of royal debauchery, the Parc-aux-Cerfs. The name itself, Stag Park, conjures images of a vast wooded estate, a secluded palace at its center, filled with nymphs pursued by a lustful king. This is the fantasies the propagandists sold to a horrified public, a sprawling, decadent harem built to satisfy a monarch's insatiable desires. But as with everything in this story, the truth is far more prosaic and infinitely more chilling. The Parc-aux-Cerfs was not a grand estate. The name was a historical ghost, a holdover from the previous century when the area was indeed a royal hunting ground for Louis XIII. By the reign of Louis XV, that land had been developed into the quiet, respectable St. Louis residential district of Versailles. The king's secret establishment was not a palace. It was a modest townhouse, utterly indistinguishable from its neighbors, located on a street just a kilometer from the palace walls. In November 1755, this property was purchased, not by the king himself, but discreetly through a proxy, an homme de paille, a man of straw, to keep the royal name off the deed. The true horror of the Parc-aux-Cerfs lies not in its imagined grandeur, but in its mundane secrecy. This wasn't a fantasy of hedonism. It was a cold, rational, and efficient solution to a political problem. A quiet house on a quiet street, a place for managing the king's appetites away from the prying eyes of the court. The perversion wasn't in the architecture, it was in the operation. And the man chosen to run this new clandestine enterprise was not a nobleman or a minister, but someone who understood the king's private needs better than anyone. A quiet house on a quiet street, a place designed to contain a king's secrets. But who held the key? Who managed this dark enterprise? The popular myth, the one whispered by Pompadour's enemies, was that she herself was the procuress, a cynical madam securing her own power by feeding the king a steady diet of disposable girls. But the truth, found in more reliable court accounts, is that she had nothing to do with it. The real operator of this procurement machine was a man who moved through the palace like a ghost, a man whose official role was to serve, but whose real job was to acquire. His name was Dominique Guillaume le Bel, the king's premier valet de chambre, his first and most trusted valet. Le Bel's process was not one of seduction. It was a chillingly methodical procedure of selection and acquisition. Imagine a young woman, perhaps from a respectable but poor bourgeois family, receiving an unbelievable invitation. Dinner at Versailles. She would be breathless with excitement, her mind racing with the possibilities of advancement, of catching the eye of a wealthy courtier. She would be seated at a lavish table, the candlelight glinting on the silver, the wine warming her blood. She would talk, laugh, and try to be charming, believing she was a guest at a party. She would be wrong. She was the product being inspected, because somewhere, in an adjoining room, hidden from view, the king himself would be watching her every move, every gesture, every smile through a crack in the wall. This was not a prelude to a romance. This was an audition she didn't know she was giving. This was a monarch selecting livestock. If she passed this silent, unnerving inspection, she would be discreetly escorted to a specific room within the palace itself, a room known by the grimly appropriate name of the trébuchet, the trap. There, the king would make his final decision. But what exactly was he looking for? What were the precise, non-negotiable criteria that La Belle was tasked to find? The answer reveals the king's deepest fears, and a preference so disturbing it had to be hidden from the world. This methodical inspection, this cold acquisition of human beings, required more than just a secret house and a loyal valet. It required money. A steady, untraceable flow of gold to purchase the property, to pay the servants, to provide lavish gifts, and ultimately to buy the silence of everyone involved. But an operation this sensitive, this potentially explosive, could never appear on the public books. If you were to comb through the surviving accounts of the royal treasury, you would find no line item for the Parc-aux-Cerfs, no budget for a clandestine brothel. The expense was a ghost, a financial black hole deliberately hidden from view. So where did the money come from? It was laundered through the vast and labyrinthine budget of the Maison du Roi, the king's household, and we can pinpoint the most probable administrative veil, a department with the ironically innocent name of the menus plaisirs, the minor pleasures. Officially, this office managed the king's personal entertainments, the grand balls, the theatrical performances, the private festivities that dazzled the court. Its intendants commanded substantial budgets to pay for musicians, actors, and set designers. But beneath this glittering surface, it served a darker purpose. The same ledger that recorded the cost of a new opera was almost certainly used to conceal the purchase of a townhouse, the salary of its staff, and the generous dowries paid to its former residents. The archaic and often incomplete nature of royal financial archives provided the perfect cover for this misdirection. The deliberate lack of a clear record is, in itself, the most damning evidence. It is proof of an organized effort to maintain secrecy and plausible deniability at all costs. An entire department of the government was likely co-opted to fund the king's private appetites. The price of secrecy was immense. But what exactly was it buying? What were the non-negotiable criteria that required such an elaborate financial cover-up? The answer reveals the king's deepest fears, and a truth far more disturbing than any propagandist's lie. The elaborate financial cover-up, the clandestine house, the loyal valet. It was all in service of two non-negotiable requirements for the human inventory of the Parc-aux-Cerfs. The first was a stipulation born from the king's deepest, most primal fear. In an age before antibiotics, venereal disease was a terrifying and often fatal affliction, a rot that could consume a man from the inside out, leaving him disfigured, insane, and in agony. Louis XV was paralyzed by this fear. Therefore, every girl selected by Lebel had to be a virgin. It was a grotesque form of quality control, a guarantee of purity intended not to protect the girls, but to protect the client. This fact alone is disturbing, reducing a human being to a commodity valued only for its perceived cleanliness. But the second requirement is the one that should shock you most, the one that official histories omit, the one that transforms this story from a tale of royal infidelity into a record of organized predation. We have documented proof from multiple sources of the age of these girls. They were children, girls as young as 13 and 14 years old. One of the most famous residents, Marie-Louise O'Murphy, whose portrait by the court painter François Boucher would make her an icon of Rococo art, was identified by the adventurer Casanova as being just 13 years old when she entered the house. Let that sink in. This was not a harem of worldly courtesans. This was not a collection of willing women seeking power. This was a human inventory of children, procured through a poet, methodical process of inspection and acquisition, funded by a secret budget and managed by the king's most trusted servant. The entire machine, from the valet to the finance minister, was geared towards one purpose: to deliver children to the king's bed. The propaganda of the time, with its lurid tales of a debauched harem, was a pale imitation of this cold, bureaucratic horror. The reality was always worse than the myth. But this raises an even more disturbing question. What happens to a disposable commodity once it has been used? What was the exit strategy for these girls when the king's interest inevitably waned, or when their bodies betrayed them with the undeniable evidence of pregnancy? The entire machine, from the valet to the finance minister, was geared towards one purpose: to deliver children to the king's bed. The propaganda of the time, with its lurid tales of a debauched harem, was a pale imitation of this cold, bureaucratic horror. The reality was always worse than the myth, but this raises an even more disturbing question. What happens to a disposable commodity once it has been used? What was the exit strategy for these girls when the king's interest inevitably waned, or when their bodies betrayed them with the undeniable evidence of pregnancy? There was, of course, a procedure for that as well, a formal transactional disposal process. This was never a romance. It was a business arrangement, and it ended with a severance package. When a girl was no longer required, she was dismissed. If she was pregnant, the process was accelerated. She was provided with a substantial dowry, a golden parachute paid from the same secret ledgers that funded her acquisition. Then a suitable husband was found. Typically a man of respectable standing but without money, a provincial noble with a title but no land, or a distant courtier in need of funds. The arrangement was mutually beneficial. The husband received a fortune and a beautiful young wife, and in exchange he gave his name to the king's illegitimate child and agreed to ask no questions. This organized process of disposal served a dual purpose. It effectively purchased the silence of all parties and laundered the king's offspring into legitimacy. It is estimated that Louis XV fathered approximately 15 children through these arrangements, all of whom he provided for financially, but none of whom he ever had to acknowledge. For decades, this was the grim, repeating cycle: acquire, use, dispose. A steady stream of girls processed through the quiet house in Versailles, their youth consumed and their futures sold off. It was a perfectly contained, self-perpetuating machine. But one of its last inhabitants would break the cycle. She would not be quietly married off to a country squire. She would not disappear with a bag of gold. The final graduate of the Parc-aux-Cerfs would shatter every precedent, surviving the disposal process to achieve the one thing the entire operation was designed to prevent. She would capture the king's heart and become the next and last official mistress of France. For decades, this was the grim, repeating cycle: acquire, use, dispose. A steady stream of girls processed through the quiet house in Versailles, their youth consumed and their futures sold off. It was a perfectly contained, self-perpetuating machine, but one of its last inhabitants would break the cycle. She would not be quietly married off to a country squire. She would not disappear with a bag of gold. The final graduate of the Parc-aux-Cerfs would shatter every precedent, surviving the disposal process to achieve the one thing the entire operation was designed to prevent. She would capture the king's heart and become the next and last official mistress of France. Her name was Jeanne Bécu, a known courtesan from the Parisian demi-monde, a woman whose beauty was her only currency. She was the ultimate product of this dark enterprise, and in 1768 she ascended from the secret house to the very pinnacle of power. To make her presentable at court, a fictitious lineage was invented, and she was hastily married to a nobleman, Count Guillaume du Berry, to give her the required title. If Madame de Pompadour's bourgeois origins had shocked the court, the arrival of a former prostitute as the maîtresse en titre was an outright declaration of war on its values. Her very existence was the ultimate scandal, and it provided the perfect ammunition for a new and powerful enemy. The monarchy's obsessive secrecy had created an information vacuum around the king's private life. Now that vacuum was being filled by a torrent of illegal, pornographic pamphlets known as libelles. Printed by French expatriates in the safety of London, these booklets were smuggled across the Channel and sold in the back alleys of Paris. They were weapons of mass destruction for a monarch's reputation. Works like the anonymously published Anecdotes sur Madame la Comtesse du Barry became bestsellers, skillfully mixing factual details of her introduction to the king with the most lurid, pornographic slander. These writers took the kernel of truth, the king's secret affairs, and nurtured it into a monstrous fiction, creating a shifting repertory of anecdotes that methodically eroded the authority of the entire regime. The king's attempts to hide his behavior had backfired spectacularly. The secrecy itself became proof of guilt, allowing his enemies to define the narrative. And they were about to connect the king's private vices directly to the public suffering of the nation. The monarchy's obsessive secrecy had backfired spectacularly. The secrecy itself became proof of guilt, allowing his enemies to define the narrative. And they were about to connect the king's private vices directly to the public suffering of the nation. The poison of the libelles worked its way through the bloodstream of France, not just as scandalous gossip, but as a powerful political narrative. For the first time, the public was given a simple, satisfying answer to a complex question. Why are we starving? Why are taxes so high? The answer, screamed from the pages of these illegal pamphlets, was the king's insatiable lust. The perception of moral rot became inextricably linked with the reality of financial ruin. Every new tax levied to pay for France's costly wars was no longer seen as a state necessity, but as a personal slush fund for the king's pleasures. The real and substantial financial drain of the Parc-aux-Cerfs, hidden away in the royal ledgers, gave a kernel of truth to this powerful lie. The public began to imagine that the cost of every loaf of bread they couldn't afford was being spent on jewels for a new girl in the king's secret house. This connection was not left to the imagination for long. In 1790, with the revolution already in motion, a pamphlet was published that drew a direct, explicit line between the two. It was titled Le Parc-aux-Cerfs ou l'origine de l'affreux déficit, the Stag Park or the Origin of the Terrible Deficit. It was a masterful piece of propaganda, arguing that the nation's bankruptcy was born in the king's secret brothel. It no longer mattered what the truth was. The narrative was set. The king's private corruption was now the official cause of public misery. The king's secret pleasures had incurred a public debt, a debt that would be paid not in gold, but in blood. The king's secret pleasures had incurred a public debt, a debt that would be paid not in gold, but in blood. And so we return to where we began. December 8th, 1793. The cart rumbles on, and Jeanne Bécu, the Comtesse du Barry, the last graduate of the Parc-aux-Cerfs, is now just minutes from the guillotine. The crowd roars, a single beast with 1,000 mouths, hungry for the blood of a symbol. They see a royal whore, the embodiment of the extravagance and waste that bled their nation dry. They see the myth. But now you see the truth. You see the full, sordid journey from the back rooms of Paris to the king's bed, and from the king's bed to this final terrifying destination. You understand the machine that created her and then consumed her. Her screams for mercy are lost in the din, the pleas of a woman who was both a perpetrator and a product of a profoundly corrupt world. The story of the Parc-aux-Cerfs is not about sexual appetite. It is a story of power. The power to create a methodical process of abuse, to hide it behind a wall of secrecy and bureaucracy, and to treat human beings as disposable pleasures. It is the story of a government that could organize the procurement and disposal of children with the same dispassionate efficiency it used to manage its tax rolls. The true perversion of Louis XV's court was not the imagined chaos of an Oriental harem, but the cold, rational, and transactional nature of its cruelty. The revolutionaries who executed Madame du Barry may have condemned her as a symbol of royal excess, but they were unknowingly closing the final account on an operation far more perverse than any propagandist could have imagined. They tore down a monarchy to punish it for the sins they read about in pamphlets, just never knowing that the hidden reality, the quiet house, the valet, the children, was a horror beyond their darkest fictions.